Welcome students. Today's topic is trade and environment. The main objectives of today's topic are to understand the global trends, differing perspectives, the trade perspective, the environmental perspective, the developmental perspective. Then I'll discuss the linkage between trade and environment, and finally the impacts of trade on environment. Dear friends, the need to ensure that trade and environmental policies are mutually supportive is more pressing today than ever before. However, successful integration of these policies can only be achieved through a constructive dialogue based on far broader awareness and understanding of the complex interlinkage between trade and our environment. First and foremost, the global trends. Our world has seen fundamental and pervasive change in the last 50 years. National economies are increasingly integrated in a global economic structure where all the elements needed to produce a final good or service, production of inputs, design, assembly, management, marketing, savings for investment may be sourced from around the globe in a system held together by powerful communications and information technologies. The trend towards globalization has been driven in part by these new technologies and in part by reduced barriers to international trade and investment flows. The result has been a steady increase in the importance of international trade in the global economy. In the last 50 years, while the global economy quintupled, world trade grew by a factor of 14. Another important trend is increasing inequity. The benefits of growth have been unevenly spread. The world's 3 richest people have a combined wealth greater than the GDPs of 48 least developed countries. And the growing inequality between and within nations shows no signs of abating. In the last 50 years, the world has also seen enormous environmental change. Global carbon dioxide emissions have quadrupled, and the steady increase in nitrogen releases from vehicles and fertilizers is creating deserts of lifelessness in our oceans and lakes. 1/4 of the world's fish stocks are depleted and another 44% are being fished at their biological limits. If current trends continue for next 30 years, 2/3 of the world will live with water stress, having less than 1,000 liters of water per person a year. 1/4 of the world's mammal species are at significant risk of extinction. Such environmental damage has been driven at least in part by our increasing numbers. Population has increased about many folds since 1950 to over 7 billion at present. In the last 30 years, many major environmental agreements dealing with issues like ozone depletion, transport of hazardous waste, and migratory species have entered into force. At the regional or bilateral level, roughly 1,000 more have entered into force, constituting an enormous and complex body of environmental law. At the national level, regulators have moved from blanket, command and control solution to a mixed bag of tools that includes market-based incentives such as pollution charges and taxes. For selected problems, the result has been marked by environmental improvement, but for many more the discouraging trends continue. Furthermore, the institutions for addressing the deadly environmental problems have also evolved. Now the differing perspectives. People come to the trade environment debates from many different backgrounds. The various assumptions and worldviews they start with and their differing technological language can be important obstacles to meaningful dialogue and solutions. People understand the issues through 3 common perspectives, that of trade, environment and development. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive. Many people understand all three. What follows are crude stereotypes of each perspective, but ones that help illustrate the challenge of finding policies that simultaneously support the objectives of trade, environment, and development. First, the trade perspective. Trade creates the wealth that could be used to increase human well-being. But most national governments answer too directly to national industries and will try to preserve domestic markets for these industries, keeping foreign competitors at bay. In doing so, governments make their citizens worse off. Domestic firms become inefficient, domestic consumers pay higher prices, and more efficient foreign firms are shut out. The best protection is a strong system of rules against such behavior, such as WTO rules by which all countries abide. Even after signing such agreements, countries will look for loopholes. Banning of restricting goods on environmental grounds may be one such loophole. Trade can actually be good for the environment since it creates wealth that can be used for environmental improvement, and the efficiency gains from trade can mean fewer resources used and less waste produced. Second, the environmental perspective. The status quo seriously threatens the Earth's ecosystems, but most national governments answer too directly to national industries and will try to protect them against costly environmental demands. In doing so, governments make their citizens worse off. Domestic firms make profits, but the public subsidize them by paying the costs of environmental damage. One way to avoid these problems is a strong system of rules spelling out clearly how the environment shall be protected at the national and international levels. Even after such rules are in place, governments and industry will look to scuttle them. Trade rules forbidding certain types of environmental regulations may be one way to do so. Trade means more goods produced and thus in many cases more environmental damage. The wealth created by trade will not necessarily result in environmental improvements. Third, the developmental perspective. Over 1/5 of the world's population live in absolute poverty, most of them in developing countries, and the gap between the rich and poor countries continues to widen. Developing countries' top priority should be reducing that poverty and narrowing that gap. Openness to trade and investment may be a key way to do so by increasing exports through the links between openness and economic growth are not automatic. But rich countries protect their industries with subsidies, special trade rules, and tariff systems that hurt exporters of developing countries. The best solution is a strong set of multilateral rules against such behavior. But current WTO rules are too deeply influenced by the powerful trading nations, and liberalization has selectively benefited sectors of interest to developed countries. Over time, as such behavior is outlawed by trade rules, rich countries will look for new ways to keep foreign competition out of their markets. Banning or restricting goods on environmental grounds may be one of those ways. Demands that poor countries comply with rich country environmental standards are unfair, particularly if they are not accompanied by technical or financial assistance. Priorities differ. For example, in many poor countries, clean water is paramount, and rich countries often caused most of the environmental damage in the first place. Now, I would like to talk about the linkage between trade and environment. Environment and trade are not isolated, they are fundamentally related. Much of the environmental damage is due to the increased scale of global economic activity. International trade constitutes a growing portion of that growing scale, making it increasingly important as a driver of environmental change. As economic globalization proceeds and the global nature of many environmental problems becomes more evident, there is bound to be friction between the multilateral systems of law governing both. There are physical, legal, and institutional linkages between international trade and the environment. The links between trade and the environment are multiple, complex, and important. Trade liberalization is of itself neither necessarily good nor bad for the environment. Its effects on the environment in fact depend on the extent to which environment and trade goals can be made complementary and mutually supportive. A positive outcome requires appropriate supporting economic and environmental policies. At the most basic level, trade and the environment are related because all economic activity is based on the environment. It is the basis for all basic inputs, metals and minerals, forests and fisheries, and for the energy needed to process them. It also receives the waste products of economic activity. Trade, in turn, is affected by environmental concerns, since exporters must respond to market demands for greener goods. At another level, environment and trade represent two distinct bodies of international law. Trade law is embodied in such structures as the World Trade Organization and regional trade agreements. Environmental law is embodied in the various multilateral environmental agreements, the regional agreements, and as national and subnational regulations. It is inevitable that these two systems of law should interact. International environmental law increasingly defines how countries will structure their economic activities. Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example, have pledged to restructure their economies to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And international trade law increasingly defines how countries should make their domestic laws and policies in areas such as intellectual property rights, investment policy, and environmental protection. Views differ regarding the impacts of international trade on the quality of the natural environment. For example, expanding trade is a source of increased wealth and diffusion of technology, both of which enhance society's ability to protect and upgrade their environments. Others argue that unrestricted trade can be harmful to the environment, especially when a country's environmental policies are weak or non-existent. While trade liberalization is likely to reduce some protectionist barriers which are encouraging environmentally harmful activities, it's possible that trade liberalization could worsen particular environmental problems in the absence of appropriate domestic environmental policies. Conceivably, an expansion of trade could produce negative environmental effects so large from open markets, resulting in an overall decline in national welfare. However, this is possible only if a country lacks a domestic environmental policy that reflects its environmental values and priorities. If that is the case, the most effective action is to concentrate on introducing appropriate environmental policies and laws rather than trying to work around bad ones by foregoing trade liberalization or attempting to fine-tune interventionist trade policies. Finally, I would like to discuss the environmental impacts of trade. World trade expansion has raised the issue of relationship between trade and the environment. Is trade good or bad for the environment? The answer is not obvious. The production of goods that are imported and exported, like other production, will often have environmental effects. But will these effects increase or decrease with expanded trade? And whose responsibility is it to respond to environmental problems associated with trade? Questions such as these have received increasing attention in recent years. International attention was first focused on these issues in 1991 when the Mexican government challenged a United States law banning imports of tuna fish from Mexico. The US Marine Mammal Protection Act prohibited tuna fishing methods that killed large numbers of dolphins and banned tuna imports from countries that used such fishing methods. The Mexican government argued that this US law was in violation of the rules of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. According to the free trade principles that provide the basis for GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and for its successor, the World Trade Organization (WTO), countries cannot restrict imports except in very limited cases, such as protection of the health and safety of their own citizens. A GATT dispute panel ruled that the US could not use domestic legislation to protect the dolphins outside its own territorial limits. Although Mexico did not press for the enforcement of this decision, the tuna dolphin decision opened a major controversy over issues of trade and environment. In a similar case in 1999, the World Trade Organization ruled that the United States could not prohibit shrimp imports from countries using fishing methods that killed endangered sea turtles. The implications of this and the earlier tuna dolphin decision could affect many other international environmental issues such as forest production, hazardous wastes, and global climate change. To address these questions, we need to examine the theory and practice of international trade. Most economists believe that expanded trade is generally beneficial, promoting increased efficiency and greater wealth among trading nations. But what if expanded trade causes environmental damage? At the national level, the standard economic policy response to environmental impacts is to implement policies that internalize externalities. At the international level, however, the picture is more confused. The burden of environmental externalities associated with trade may be borne by importers, exporters, or by others not directly involved in the production or consumption of traded goods. The authority to formulate and enforce environmental policies usually exists only at the national level. This can create significant problems when environmental impacts are transnational, since most international trade agreements do not include any provisions for environmental protection. With this, we conclude. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for